welcome to the Purposeful Lab. The Purposeful Lab is a series produced by Franciscan University where we explore the purpose that is inherent in the universe and in our lives. And we do this by investigating sort of topics that are very culturally relevant. And this season, we are looking at the nature of man and woman. And our guest today is Dr. Abigail Favale, who is a professor of the practice of theology and literature at the University of Notre Dame at the McGrath Institute there at the University of Notre Dame. So, Abigail, welcome to the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, let me give our listeners a little bit about your background, and then maybe you can sort of elaborate on that. Mm-hmm. So, you've got a very fascinating interdisciplinary background, but you've got your PhD in English literature at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. You also had a master's degree from there in was it gender studies, and then your first faculty position was at George Fox University. And then you recently moved to University of Notre Dame, where you took your current position there within the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And you sort of are at this intersection of Catholic theology, literature, and women's studies. And I think there's probably not that many people that are at that intersection. Yeah. But your work, you've written a number of books. You have one really good book about your sort of conversion experience, your journey from evangelicalism to postmodern feminism to the Catholic Church. That's Into the Deep. And then you have another book I'm sure we'll talk about today, which is The Genesis of Gender, a Christian Theory. So, Abigail, again, welcome to the show. And maybe you can just give our listeners sort of an overview of your academic journey. What got you into the position you have now at Notre Dame, coming from evangelical and then postmodern feminism background.
I know, it is sort of a strange itinerary. And yeah, I mean, I'm a generalist at heart, I'll be honest. Okay. I'm not one of these kind of hyper-specialized academic eggheads that's like, I'm only going to care about this one narrow field, because I really love theology and literature and philosophy, right? And so my work is very much kind of, those things are intertwined. And I've always loved stories. I've loved writing ever since I was a little kid. And then when I went to college, I fell in love with philosophy, so it kind of awakened a part of my intellectual life that had never really been awakened, and developed a love for philosophy and theology, and then also feminism. So I have long been interested in questions about women's purpose and women's dignity, especially in a theological sense. And so following those questions as an undergrad kind of led me to an encounter with feminist thought. And so I began studying feminist theology and philosophy a little bit as an undergrad. And then I decided to specialize in those, but in the discipline of literature. So I was doing a literature PhD, but also specializing in feminist theory and women's writing. That was kind of my angle in the doctorate program. Yeah. And that time in my life when I was in grad school was a very secular chapter of my life. I didn't really practice Christianity at all. I thought a lot about it. I dissertated about it. But I was very much kind of inhabiting, what I would call a more postmodern, post-Christian kind of posture toward the faith. And then I had a bizarre conversion to Catholicism at the age of 30 after kind of establishing my career early on as a feminist academic and teaching courses in women's studies and gender theory as well as literature. And then when I became Catholic, it coincided with a shift in my teaching duties. I started teaching in a Great Books program at George Fox where I was teaching. And that turned out to be so wonderful and intellectually freeing. Yeah. And it helped me realize, kind of fall in love again with theology and philosophy at the same time I was deepening and renewing my faith as a Catholic. So
your conversion happened, so this is after grad school, and you're now faculty member at George Fox. And exactly. It was during that time, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so that was I was 12 years at George Fox, and most of my time there I was involved in the Great Books program. And that's also when I became Catholic 10 years ago. And then I started really thinking and writing about these questions related to women and sexual difference, but from a Catholic perspective. but also with this kind of insider knowledge of feminist theory and gender studies. So like you said, it kind of, I'm unusually bilingual in that sense, in that I've been kind of inside both ways of viewing the world at different points in my life.
Yeah, I'm sure that gives you a very unique perspective, because not many people take that with them into sort of the Catholic worldview, right? To be able to
Correct.
see and dialogue with that in a fruitful way, I think, is sort of postmodern feminism. So you published a book, The Genesis of Gender. So maybe you could, what was the sort of the basis for that book, and what were you trying to do there, and what was the message? It's hard to sum up a book in a little pithy message, but what was the angle you're trying to get across there in terms of that book?
Well, it started out as a book about Catholicism and feminism, because I was still ambivalent and trying to work through that question in my own mind. Like, what is the relationship between Catholicism and feminism? But then when I got into writing the book and I started writing a chapter on gender, it just started growing and growing and growing. And then I emailed my editor and I was like, I think this is a different book. It's like becoming a different book, because I realized in the process of writing how much there was to say on that topic. And this was also when the first kind of wave of young women detransitioners was coming out and telling their story. And so there seemed to be a lot happening on the cultural front where I really wanted to dig into that question. And so the book that it became focused on gender. I would say the purpose of that book was kind of was really trying to articulate that the kind of common understanding of gender that has emerged in our culture is a fundamentally different way of seeing than the Christian understanding of gender. And I think looking back at my own history and my own kind of intellectual and spiritual journey, I feel like I stepped out of the Christian frame without realizing it. And so I wanted to I want people to know kind of the things, like the ideas behind what they might be accepting, right? Because I think it's too easy to kind of adopt a certain worldview almost by osmosis. And I think I certainly did that in graduate school. And so I really wanted to kind of bring my insider knowledge of gender theory to say, okay, here's the philosophical development of the concept of gender. Here are the philosophical assumptions operating when we use phrases like sex assigned at birth. So at least if you just decide to kind of ascribe to that understanding of reality, at least know what you're ascribing to.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my hope for the book, was to articulate to Christians. It's kind of written to people of faith, even though I hope it's open to readers beyond that. But it's really trying to articulate that there are two different kind of ways of seeing gender.
Yeah. We do see, as a professor here at Franciscan, you see students coming in with sort of a cultural view of gender, right? They pick this up by osmosis. But maybe you could just sort of elaborate sort of how we should view that term, and what's a Christian or Catholic way of viewing gender, or is it a term that is taken on too much baggage that we should just not use that term? Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. And that one I'm a little ambivalent about, because I think that gender has become a term with no clear external referent. Okay. Right. So one of the philosophical shifts that's happened in the development of the concept is that gender has become something completely uprooted from sex, from biological sex. Okay. So the kind of two main versions of gender theory, I would say, that are in the water in our time would be that gender is a social construct. So it's something external to the self, and it's socially constructed. Or we also have, I think, even more recently and more prominently, a more subjectivist understanding of gender. So gender is an internal experience, this kind of core to the self that, again, has only a kind of arbitrary or no connection at all to biological sex. So gender has become something that is disconnected from sex, which I think is a big problem, right? And so disconnected from sex, it can kind of take on all these different meanings. So it doesn't have a clear fixed meaning. So in that sense, I don't like the term because it is inherently ambiguous. Right. Yeah. At the same time, it's a very common term that people use instinctively and interchangeably with biological sex. And so used in that way, I actually don't mind that at all. And in fact, when I use the term gender, I'm probably casually meaning that.
Yeah.
Right?
So you're
Unless
linking it with sex. So in that
yes.
sense, and I slip into that. What's your gender? What's your sex? A lot of people are asking the same question. They're equating the two,
Yes.
and there it's sort of rooted in something. It sort of means something. But you're right. It really, once you disconnect it, there, what do you root it to? Subjective experience or some changing? Because as a social construct, right, it's something that can change as
Yes.
we, as society changes, right? What is the root of the use of that term? Like historically, it starts right as a social construct, or does it start rooted towards biological sex in terms of its initial uses as it goes through different iterations?
Yes, it really does. So this is a big part of the book, The Genesis of Gender. So the first way the title kind of plays out is tracing the genesis of the term gender. And I start in the 20th century, even though you could start the story earlier, but I really start when the term gender tends to kind of like it just comes and begins to be pretty dominant in the psychological, social, and social sciences and the humanities, right? So I kind of trace the term there where it emerges in the work of sexologists like John Money and Robert Stoller. And then from there, it becomes imported into second wave feminist thought, where it is used as a term that describes the kind of social and cultural expressions of sexual difference. So in that kind of classic framing of like sex versus gender, which is still around, I think especially people who are of a certain age, maybe 40 and older, let's say, and who have been educated in this theory, like this is what they think, they still are operating in the terms of, well, sex refers to biology and gender refers to the kind of cultural norms and interpretations of biological sex. So that distinction is not a bad distinction to make. I mean, it's certainly true that there are differences between the sexes that are more strictly natural, and there are differences that are more kind of cultural in origin. You can think of like hair length, right? Like it's not as if women's hair naturally grows longer than men's hair, right? It's just there's a kind of stylistic norm that women wear their hair a certain way, right? So it's not a bad distinction to make, and that's how feminists begin using the term. But then this idea of gender as a social construct begins to, as the philosophy develops, especially with Judith Butler and postmodern gender theory, then gender begins to kind of absorb all the meaning that we normally would give to sex. So Butler kind of argues that not only is gender a social construct, but sex itself is a social construct. Like sex itself is part of the production of gender. So the tendency that we have to kind of read human reality into these two binary categories, that's more of a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. So that would be kind of the big step toward the constructionist view. But then I think that kind of anti-realist understanding of gender, or that understanding of gender, or basically that deconstruction of just sexual difference as a stable natural reality, that paved the way for then a subjectivist understanding of gender as well, right? So that was, I think, that's like of all the weird kind of theories of gender we have floating around right now, the common denominator is the deconstruction of sexual difference as the ground of gender.
Right. And pulling that apart, not saying it's not real. It's something that we've socially constructed, or it's something that is subjective in a sense that like our biology isn't, it doesn't have any real meaning in terms of who we are. That seems to be sort of where we've gotten as a society with understanding sex and gender at this point. Is that the way you would see it, or is there some remnants of sort of biological grounding of either of these terms now?
I mean, I would say the way that gender is increasingly used in certain sectors, like academia, basically anything kind of middle class, and I'm kind of, I still think like the average normie American is going to have a very like clear, intuitive sense that gender is about sex.
Right.
And if you ask them, what's your gender? They're going to answer with their sex. right? Like I still think that, I mean, that intuition is so deeply ingrained because it's so deeply attached to reality
Right.
that it takes like a tremendous amount of effort you have to be kind of educated or brainwashed out of thinking that way. But a lot of people have been. So
Yes. Yeah.
that's why you see these different understandings of gender that are, but I would say that the most common understanding of gender is really the one that sees gender as this kind of core of the self that's deeply real, that's immutable, but is also that it's not determined by the body at all.
Yeah.
So the body is almost like this inert kind of substrate upon which the kind of gendered self imprints its gender, if that makes sense, right? So gender isn't read from the body. It has to be imposed onto the body because the body doesn't kind of come with its own meaning. And the body doesn't come with its own kind of intrinsic order to it, right? So even distinctions between like what is a healthy body or what is a pathological state of the body, those categories no longer make sense because what is normal or natural or innate for the body is determined by the kind of the gender consciousness, right? So if the gender consciousness experiences itself as male, then the body needs to be male,
right,
whether or not it actually is. And if it's female, then that's a problem that needs to be fixed, right?
Yeah, and there seems to be a disunity then between the internal self and this external self. There's like this weird dualism that creeps in that I am, what I think I am, and the body is just could be in my way of being who I am, rather than no, I am my body. And more than I'm, from a Catholic perspective, I'm in a soul body, but the body is something outside of me, in a sense.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'll also say, I think we all think that way to some extent as moderns.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's just, there's these weird people over here who have this sense of self. I think we very much live in kind of Cartesian dualist waters, and we tend to locate our selfhood in our consciousness.
Yeah.
And we too often see the body as either, almost like this profile that needs to be kind of curated so it can then express our true self, right? So I think this way of thinking plays out in other ways, not just related to kind of medicalized gender interventions. So it's something that I think we need to all kind of check ourselves a little bit about. Like, do I think like,
right?
Do I have this implicit Cartesian understanding of my own selfhood and my embodiment?
Yeah, what's the danger of that? This inherent, just for your average person, because you have this thing, I am my thoughts, and that's real, and then my body gets in my way of things I want to do sometimes, right? So what do you see as the danger of that view outside of just sort of the sex and gender issues?
Well, I mean, from especially a Catholic perspective, it's really at odds with a Catholic anthropology and just the Catholic faith in general. Right. I mean, if our bodies are not intrinsic to who we are, the Christian faith makes absolutely no sense. Why would God become a body?
Right.
Yeah, why would God sacrifice his body? Why would God resurrect his body? Why would God ascend with his body? Why would God then kind of reappear, in the Eucharist under a tangible form?
Physical thing.
Why? Yeah, exactly. Like why would we need to have both a physical sacraments, right? Why do we need physical sacraments?
Yeah.
Why is our body going to be raised from the dead, right? So if the body doesn't matter, then Christianity doesn't make sense, right? So on one level, I would say that's something that's at stake.
For sure.
But also because I think Catholic anthropology is not just, I think it's true. Right? Like I think it's actually describing what the reality of who we are. Right. And so if we have an anthropology that is at odds with the reality of who we are, then there's going to be kind of problems downstream. So if we think if the body really is intrinsic to who we are, but we think of it as an object or an instrument, right? Then that's going to have negative effects, I think, just on an individual level in how we treat our own bodies and how we treat the bodies of others,
Right. Yeah.
especially in how we treat the bodies of others that are imperfect or that are suffering or that are dying or that are unborn, right? Like if you don't really, so you can kind of see how this depersonalization of the body, it's around in so many kind of ethical problems that our culture is wrestling with today.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. And our theology for Catholic is deeply incarnational, and that
Right.
God's entered this creation and sort of makes all creation is valuable and is real. One of the things that I think I've seen is the whole idea of transhumanism is sort of wrapped up in this sort of transgenderism. It's the idea, it's a similar mechanism that my body is inhibiting my fulfillment. And if we can get a body that's go beyond human, right? And change my body into something else, then I can really flourish, And I think that same mentality is there in sort of the transgender sort of movement, where it's that my body is hindering me, and so it's another area you see that you're pointing out all these other areas where we see that dualism causing problems in the way we should be thinking about ourselves and other people. So that's interesting. One of the things I read an article you wrote, and this it struck me because I had this similar thought talking to students about sort of a modern view of sex and sexuality and gender. And you wrote about how a lot of people say, well, your sexual orientation is determined by your biology, but at the same time, your sex is defined at birth. And maybe you could speak a little to that and sort of the incongruity that's there, and how do people live with that incongruity?
Right. Right. So there's kind of a or like a contradiction in some, I guess, like reigning pop orthodoxies about how this works. So the contradiction is that on the one hand, there's a claim that sexual orientation is innate. So a person can be born with an innate attraction to a particular sex, right? Yeah. But then on the other hand, you have the claim that sex itself is not something innate. Sex is a construct, right? So you can't have an inborn attraction to a social construct, right? And you can't have an inborn attraction to someone's consciousness, right? Yeah. Which you can't even be like, because the idea of sexual orientation is like, some attractive member of the sex you're attracted to walks into the room and you notice that, right? But how can you be attracted to someone's, in the understanding of like sex being about one's consciousness?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, you can't even know what sex someone is until you ask them, right? Yeah, right. So this understanding of gender, either the constructionist view or the subjectivist view, is completely contradictory to the idea that sexual orientation is innate. Right, because the idea of sexual orientation actually takes the reality of sex very seriously, right? Because it kind of asserts that one can have a kind of predominant attraction to a sex, right? So in order for that theory to be plausible, sex has to be real, and it has to be something that's innate if an orientation to sex can be innate, right? The kind of pop gender theory right now just does not work with that concept at all. So that was something I would point out to my students who kind of wanted to hold on to both, right? Like, well, no, of course, someone is born gay.
Right.
But then how can someone be born gay if sex isn't real?
Yeah, right. Right? Exactly. So how do they handle that? I just wonder, do they just throw their hands up? Because you have to have some, I think to get yourself out of that, you have to come to some realization that there's some reality out there that you've got to conform your mind to. And it seems like that's something that we've lost in our culture to some extent,
yes.
Right? And so do they just say, well, it's all subjective? And so my view is that this isn't subjective, sexual orientation, but this is, and then just say, well, I'm going to live with that dichotomy there, or do they start? Is that an avenue? I guess what I'm asking, is that an avenue to get them to see, hey, maybe there's an underlying reality here that I need to sort of orient myself to?
I mean, I think they see it. Yeah. Like I can see in their faces, like, oh, they're like, oh, hadn't thought about that one, right? So they don't necessarily are able to like resolve it right away. So I can tell it like gets them, and And I love the fact that that bothers them because, you know, I think we are by nature assume there's something that is true, there's something that is real, that logic exists, right? So those, even if, you know, they might be willing to live in cognitive dissonance, they do notice the contradiction. And it's true, this whole debate has become, you know, something of a little, you know, there have been controversies about dating apps, for example, where there are like lesbian dating apps. But then men who identify as women will be on the lesbian dating apps, right?
Okay.
And then, you know, so there's been controversy about this, right? So you have some people in the kind of, like maybe some of the LGBT are very much calling this out and saying, look, you know, this doesn't actually make any sense, right? But then you also have this kind of tremendous pressure from the kind of T activism of that world, which says, no, it's transphobic to expect a woman to have a certain phenotype, right? So that's kind of the way that they deal with it, right? Like even Judith Butler's latest book that I read, you know, she kind of goes, she critiques the gender critical feminists who are kind of saying, for example, that like J.K. Rowling, right? So she critiques people like J.K. Rowling who are making the case that sex is real and that it matters for women and that there should be some single sex spaces that are preserved, right? And she just basically accuses them of phobia of the penis. Like they just have penis phobia, right? So there's this weird kind of rhetorical, like, again, kind of like, even that the kind of fragmented and depersonalization of the body is still operating even in how they deal with this question, right? Where it's like, oh, you know, if you expect a man to have a penis, then you just have a fetish for the penis, right? Okay. You know, or like I'm not kidding. Like this might be like I might be pushing the boundaries for some of your listeners here talking this way, but like this is kind of the rhetoric that's used, right? This is the thinking that's used. So you have body parts, right, that are kind of like we're like Mr. Potato Heads or something.
They have no real meaning in terms of
they have no kind of intrinsic organizational meaning to them. And so in that sense, I'm like, well, what does it even mean to be attracted to a man or a woman? Like if it has nothing to do with embodiment, like what am I attracted to? You know, it's not clearly defined at all. So,
that embodiment, you know, is sort of a foundation. But out of that, you build, you know, you were talking before about sort of gender roles in society and so forth. Do you see, you know, when we talk about gender roles, do you see those, like from a feminist perspective or a Catholic perspective, how do those hinder or, you know, facilitate people living out their inherent dignity, right? Do you see those things as good? Having like saying, oh, these are sort of the way we see the feminine gender or masculine gender. Does that inhibit our sort of ability to be who we're meant to be, or does that help guide us? Do you think, or is that something that just becomes problematic?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's a complicated question. On the one hand, I think norms that respond to the reality of sexual dimorphism are generally, that's a good thing. Now, I'm not going to say every norm that does is a good thing, but I'm saying you know, for example, like policies related to leave that take seriously the fact that pregnancy and lactation and newborn phase are very taxing for a woman and she needs to be with her baby and, you know, like that to protect that good and not, and to see that as something that's beneficial for society. Right. So, so I think, for example, like those things are good. However, I think when we talk about gender roles, specific gender roles, I think often tend to be very tied to particular cultural, historical, and economic contexts. So I find in general, it's not as helpful to kind of abstractly make these pronouncements like men are the ones who should work outside the home, women are the ones who should work inside the home. because that seems to one presume a kind of modern post-industrial kind of context, right? And so I guess I would say I fall in line with what I understand to be the kind of current magisterial teaching on this, which is that for a husband and wife who, marriage and motherhood and fatherhood are their primary vocation. And so the home and the good of the family should be the kind of epicenter for both of them, right? No matter who kind of happens to work outside the home or not, whether it's both or one or whichever one. And that I think each married couple has to kind of discern, based on their own particular circumstances, what's best for their family in terms of those sorts of roles. So I very much see like the work of men and women as collaborative. Some recent magisterial texts about men and women, talk about how, the kind of genius of women should be brought to every sphere of society, right? That there's a particular kind of sensibility and attentiveness to the dignity of the person that women bring, and that can be manifest and lived out in all kinds of different ways. But that genius, right, is not something that should be confined in a particular role necessarily, right? So I think I really love the Catholic position because on the one hand, it's very countercultural because it is in a sense prioritizes the domestic for both the man and the woman. It prioritizes the home and the family.
Right, yeah.
At the same time, there's a sense that, neither the man or the woman should like fully be kind of defining themselves by their profession first and foremost, right? So when it comes to roles, I'm a little more, that's kind of my perspective, is that these are the practical living out of masculinity and femininity has to be kind of discerned based on one's circumstances and has to be responsive to those circumstances.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it seems like the Catholic position is sort of a both and that there is this difference between men and women, and this difference is real, but it doesn't then dictate limit sort of like there's still this freedom of expression of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man. And in a sense, is that how you would see that? But it's not like absolute freedom, which is sort of what what we have in society now, where I can live out my masculinity in any way, and one way is to be a woman.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I think maybe another way of putting it is like there are spheres in which sexual dimorphism really matters.
Yeah.
And when it matters, and we should acknowledge that reality. Like it matters in sports. It matters probably in certain combat roles in the military, right? It matters when it comes to gestation and procreation and maternity leave, things like that. So, I'm not like a kind of hardcore egalitarian where it's like men and women are completely interchangeable. Right. I don't think that. But I think what is the kind of root and foundation of their difference is their generative potential and how that is actualized in very different ways. Like in a lot of differences between the sexes, either there aren't statistically significant differences, or if they are, it might be a kind of a bimodal sort of spectrum where there's a lot of overlap.
Right.
But when it comes to reproduction, it comes to procreation, here we have a complete asymmetry, right? It's wildly different. And so we kind of deceive ourselves if we pretend that difference doesn't matter. And that's one of my critiques of feminism, is that I think feminism in dealing with that sexual asymmetry has kind of proposed that women have to kind of go to war with their fertility. They have to go to war with their body. They have to go to war with their capacity for motherhood and try through technology to become as much physiologically like a man as possible. Yeah. Right, in order to kind of be free. I think it's telling that, the feminist movement fought for the right to abortion before they fought for the right for pregnant women not to be fired from their jobs, right? Yeah. So I think that shows a kind of priority in their proposed solution. So I think we should take sexual difference very seriously. But then I think when we get further and further away from bodily differences and begin to extrapolate those into kind of abstracted differences that may or may not, be really pronounced at all, that's where I urge more caution.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're reading that what modern feminism sort of fought for. It's almost like they're fighting for the worst aspects of the male personality. So what males, this sort of sexual license, things like that, you can see in dominating and so forth. That like that's women need to be like that as well, and take on the worst aspects of sort of masculinity rather than correcting where men are getting it wrong and proposing a vision of what women, how they flourish, right? Yeah. And what do you see as sort of you've talked a little bit about the way the church views this. What do you see as sort of the benefit of sort of the church's vision of what it means to be male and female, and how that helps both men and women engage with each other and with society at large?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, my reading of feminism is that this is a movement or a collection of movements that is responding to very real dynamics between the sexes that are a result of the fall.
Right, yeah.
So I think there very much is a sense in which the fall has distorted the dynamic of harmony and mutual love and communion between the sexes to a relationship that tends toward conflict and domination. Mm-hmm. And there, historically speaking, we can say that has tended to be more male domination over the female than vice versa. Although, of course, on individual circumstances and then in certain ways, it can be reversed. So women can try to kind of do the same thing to men, right? You could even say that some forms of feminism fall into that. So I think that's where I see a big kind of overlap potentially between feminism and Catholicism, in the sense that the feminist movement is kind of rightly sniffing out that something's amiss, right? Exactly. Something's not quite right, in ways that tend to degrade women. But then the solutions that it offers, I think, tend to almost further the problem. So I feel like Catholicism recognizes the fallenness, but also offers this vision, one of a kind of original vision that we see in the book of Genesis of sexual difference and its dignity and its purpose. I mean, if you look at all kind of an array of different creation cosmologies from the ancient world, you'll see that Genesis is weirdly focused on sexual difference and is weirdly positive about it. It's really unique in that way. You could almost argue in the kind of second Genesis creation account that the creation of, or the kind of completion of the human being as male and female, it's the culmination to God's creative work. It's like the highlight. It's like the climax, right?
Yeah.
So it's immensely important, and it's presented as something really good. But then there's also the fall. But then in Catholic theology, there's also a sense that through the grace of God and through individual conversion, we can begin to undo the effects of the fall in our relationships here and now, even though it won't fully be perfected until the next life. So I think Catholicism offers an accurate diagnosis of the problem, but also, offers a kind of real solution, which is individual conversion and the pursuit of holiness. That's which isn't to say other things like policies and everything don't matter. Sure. Right. But it has to begin there. It has to begin with a conversion of heart. And so I think a lot of kind of feminist analysis will begin, we'll just go straight to the social, right? Like, what's wrong with the social structures? But if, the evil that we see manifest in social structures originates because of the evil in the human heart, right? So that's kind of the origin of the problem. So I think Catholicism gives enormous dignity to the sexes. I feel seen, I guess, as a woman in Catholicism in a way that I didn't as an evangelical, and I never did as a feminist, which is ironic. But I think, feminism is very suspicious, ironically, I think, of valuing sexual difference. It tends to see sexual difference as a source of oppression. Primarily.
That's an interesting comment that you just made, that having seen as a woman, as a Catholic, more so than as a feminist or a Protestant evangelical. Well, could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because that's not something that you hear people say. So it would be great to hear more on that.
Well, so as an event, I think if you look at the aspects of Christianity that were kind of lost or downplayed after the Reformation, you'll see that a lot of them are kind of the feminine and bodily aspects of the faith. We lose the church as a mother. We, see Mary kind of totally sidelined. We lose kind of a rich communion of saints that include both male and female saints. We lose the sacraments, right? This kind of tangible, bodily, physical avenue of grace. And I think, so growing up in that kind of legacy of Christianity, then the masculine aspects of the faith, like God as Father, Christ's maleness, those are very much present and very much emphasized. But then it just comes off feeling like very male, like the faith is very male. And it's not even that like women are sort of denigrated actively. It's just like they're not really even thought about at all, right? It's just kind of like, I never heard a sermon about a woman growing up. Right? Like it's just like I think the message I received is just like women don't matter. Right. And then in feminism, I think, as I was just sort of saying, there is a sense that sexual difference is not something beautiful, it's not something sacred, but it's something that's a source of oppression, and that women's nature is a disadvantage. Right. That it basically like it sucks to be a woman. That's kind of the vibe that you get from feminism is like read The Second Sex. Like read The Second Sex. You come away with that just like, gosh, it sucks to be a woman, And so I think in Catholicism, we have like the fullness and the restoration of, kind of the Catholic vision of reality, where you almost have this kind of symphonic understanding of the sexes, right? I think of it like a song where you have like the two registers that are being sung and there's this harmony. And even if you just walk into a Catholic space, like there's female bodies all over the place, right? Like there's just in the Catholic imagination, like the feminine has such a prominent symbolic role that I think really matters and really conveys a sense of dignity and importance to women. So that's kind of what I mean. I feel like as a Catholic, I've so long been chasing this question about like women's meaning, like do women matter? And I feel like in Catholicism, I found a very like unequivocal yes.
Yeah.
They matter.
That's great. That's a wonderful way of putting it there. Just get an impression of where the students that you teach are at this point, in society, because it seems like we've gone this deconstructionist way to the point where we can't really go any further because you have these things now are self-contradictory. You can't hold these things, and the body doesn't matter in one sense, and it does matter in another sense in terms of what we talked about before in terms of sexual orientation versus transgenderism. And once you start to say sex as a social construct, things start to fall apart where you can't protect women in certain spaces, and we really start eating ourselves. And I just want our students now, they're coming into college and sort of been raised in this milieu. What do you see them as sort of questioning this idea, fed up with it, seeing like a turn, or are they still like in your classes? What's their attitude towards this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so I've been at Notre Dame for 2 years now, and I just started teaching undergrads last year. And I'm teaching a course right now called Catholicism and the Sexes. And it seems like most of the students in my class, there's about 40 of them, and it's probably a self-selecting crew.
Right.
They seem to be just like pretty serious Catholics, right?
Okay.
So they come in, they're already suspicious of this stuff, right? And these things have become culture war issues as well. And so I think that, students who become kind of politically aligned one way or the other
Right.
will
Yeah.
also just kind of like accept the sort of packaged beliefs about issues. So I feel like I have less of a sense right now for what the kind of average, like, not politically captured, but not particularly devout student thinks about these things. My guess would be they don't really think about them much at all, right? My impression is that it's very much still like in the water. It's in the rhetoric of academia and student life and all those sorts of things, like the kind of, politically correct terminology that you're supposed to use. But I think a lot of students, they're just worried about like getting good grades and getting into med school,
Right.
and they're not even really thinking about this kind of stuff a lot.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about my Catholic students is, so they have been really obsessed with this question about whether or not the soul is sexed, which has really surprised me. I didn't really have that on my radar when I was planning the course.
Interesting.
And so it's taken me a while to try to figure out, why do you care about this? Like, what's at stake in this question for you, right? And I think what's happening, I think my students have two intuitions. One is good and one is bad. Their first intuition is that sexual difference really matters,
Mm-hmm.
and that being male or female, being a man or a woman is integral to who I am. It's an enduring reality. It's a sacred reality. That's a good intuition. But then I think their second intuition is that the body doesn't really matter that much. And so if sexual difference is kind of located primarily in the body or arises from the body, then that means it doesn't really matter, right? So it has to be located in the soul, because they seem to want the soul to be sexed.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, of course, like not the traditional Thomistic hylomorphic perspective, right? Even though there are Catholic theologians that argue for the soul being sexed, like it is an open question in that sense. But yeah, so I do think even among like devout Catholics, I think there's a kind of implicit Cartesian dualism, a kind of sense that who I really am is kind of the contents of my consciousness.
Yeah, right.
Right. And that's kind of housed in a body, but it's really rooted in the soul because that's what really matters. Right. So I think that's been interesting to kind of pick up on that intuition and try to fight against it a little bit. Right.
Right.
Try to push them back into like, the body really matters, and the body is good. Like, we are our bodies. Of course we're embodied souls, like you said, but in a very real sense, like that's what makes us us.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, this has been a great conversation, Abigail. I really appreciate you sitting down with me and talking through some of these issues. I just want to end just sort of, do you have just a feeling, is what's underlying a lot of the confusion, do you think, that people have about gender and sex? Is it primarily that they've sort of lost a moral compass? Is there something about our society, this radical sort of individualization that you think is underlying, or is there something else? You think, or is there not something sort of universal that's underlying sort of where we've gotten to in terms of, first with gender making that sort of relative, and then sex becoming relative? Is there some underlying philosophical or theological thing that's underpinning all of this in your view?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot going on. I would say, I think there has been a loss of the understanding of the human being as a creature, and the loss of an understanding of a creator, right? So a loss of the understanding of us having a nature that is good and that has a kind of inherent wisdom and dignity in it, and that the good life, even in this life, flourishing is found by working in harmony with our nature rather than against it. So I think there's this sense now that the kind of good life or flourishing is found by kind of imposing my will and having kind of complete freedom in the imposition of my will. So there's not a sense in which, like, there's a nature that we have received that is actually not under our control, and that comes with limits.
Yeah.
And learning to respect and embrace and work within those limits is actually part of what it means to be human, not fighting against or exceeding or conquering those limits. And so I think there's a kind of conceptual or philosophical thing going on there that's paired with the technological, because then the way we use technologies kind of feeds into this, technologies that actually try to, kind of subvert our nature so that we have control over it. So reproductive technologies,
Right. Yeah.
Kind of cross sex technologies, but also I would even say like the internet, social media, these digital technologies that kind of immerse, especially young people, in a kind of disembodied world where who you are is actually completely under your own kind of creative control, where you can become you can become anyone. You can be like an elf named, whatever, like Legolas, whatever, like online, like you can be whatever you want, And so I think there's almost this like attempt to bring that kind of liquidity to our nature that you can get a taste of in the digital world into the real world.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that's maybe at the root of it.
Yeah, there's that radical sort of freedom to do anything that you want, rather than the freedom to live out what my sort of nature is, right? John Paul II talked about that quite a bit, about that difference in freedom. So yeah, that's great. Abigail, thanks again for joining us. I just want to let the listeners know again about the couple of books that you've written. The first one was Into the Deep, about your conversion story, and the second one is The Genesis of Gender, Christian Theory, which goes into a lot of some of the stuff that we touched on today. Both excellent reads. So thanks again for joining us and for taking the time to sit down and talk with us.
Yeah, this was fun. Okay. Thank you.
All right, for our listeners, this series about the nature of man and women, hopefully you join us on the next episode of this as we continue to explore this on the Purposeful Lab.